ReefBum is sponsored by Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video. So in this video I wanted to provide my top 10 tips for working with PVC pipe. But before we get into that, if you want to help support the channel, I do sell a bunch of SPS frags on reefbum.com, as well as the equipment I use for my tanks. So with that said, let's get into the video.
Alright, so to begin with, why use PVC to plumb a sump to a display tank? Well, I really think it's a lot more bulletproof versus flexible PVC tubing. You know, you got a much more permanent bond using the PVC primer and the cement. So it's going to be a lot more leak proof. And if you're in this for the long haul, it makes a lot of sense to take the extra time. It does take a lot of time to do the PVC work in terms of getting all the angles correct and the proper size cuts. But in my opinion, it is worth the extra time that you put in over the long haul. Okay, tip number 1. Always use purple primer versus clear primer. Now, in many towns, it is actually, for plumbers, it is part of the code where they have to use purple primer, because when their work gets inspected, they need to, the inspectors need to make sure that everything has been glued properly, and the purple primer, you can obviously see it, versus clear primer. And I've used clear primer in the past, and let me tell you, it's certainly a lot neater. You know, with the purple primer, it can get a little sloppy in spots. So, you know, for one project, I did use clear PVC primer, and certain joints that I thought I had put primer on and also had glued were not glued, and there was a lot of leaks. And one last thing about primer, you should always use primer because it really preps the joints, and it actually starts the chemical reaction that bonds the PVC together in terms of the fitting and the pipe. So it's always very important to use a primer. It helps to clean the joints, but it also does help to prep and start that chemical reaction. All right, tip number 2. And this is related to tip number 1. To ensure that I know a connection is glued, even though I'm using purple PVC primer to make it obvious that something has been glued. Sometimes you don't see a lot of the primer on the connection. It can be a little subtle if you're too good, if you're really neat. So what I like to do is take a Sharpie and put a marker on each glue connection. So I put a G for glue on each connection. And now I am positively 100% sure that I did indeed glue the pipe into the fitting. Tip number 3, always measure twice before cutting pipe. And the reason why is, you know, sometimes you've got some complicated work going on here. You've got a lot of funky angles, and you need to get the pipe to fit in an exact certain spot and a certain angle. You need to really be careful in terms of your cuts. If you cut it too much, then you're going to have to do have a do-over. And if you have too much pipe to make a connection, then things are not going to line up properly. So I always recommend measuring twice. And you also have to account for the amount of the pipe that's going to slip into the fitting. So that's always something that you have to be aware of. All right, tip number 4, dry fit the PVC pipe into the fitting. And I'm not talking about doing dry fitting to determine the length of the pipe. What I'm talking about is doing some dry fitting to make sure that you have the proper angles. So when you apply the primer and the glue, that the fitting will be at the right angle that you want it to be at. So, you know, right here I've got a 90-degree angle, and then I want to come out straight here, but then also go 90 degrees that way. And to do that, what I'll do is I'll take a Sharpie, and here's an example, and I'll dry fit, and I'll mark a couple of lines on the fitting itself and on the pipe itself So when I apply the primer to the inside and the primer to the outside and the glue, I put it together, I know it's going to line up to where I want it to line up. Tip number 5, you must be quick when you're working with the PVC primer and the glue. I'd say you've got about 10 seconds to slip in the pipe to a fitting when you apply the primer and then the glue. About 10 seconds you can really kind of move stuff around. At about 30 seconds that thing is pretty rock solid. So you really do have to visualize in your mind what you want to do, and like I said, doing the markers will certainly help in terms of making it a efficient use of your time. Tip number 6, always make sure the PVC pipe is all the way in a fitting. So using this 90-degree 1-inch elbow as an example, the pipe can slip in as much as 1 inch. That's as far as it can go in. And what I like to do is to measure that out on the pipe that's going into the socket. So when you're using the purple primer and the cement, it's going to slide right in. But in terms of dry fitting, you know, it's not going to be able to go all the way in there. So what I like to do is, knowing that it's an inch in terms of how far it can go in to that fitting, I'll mark just below an inch, because I'm assuming I'm not going to be able to get it all the way in, because the cuts could be a little imprecise. So I'll mark just below an inch, and I'll make this line very easy to see. So once I put the primer and then the cement inside the fitting and also on the pipe, I will have a good marker in terms of telling me that the pipe is as far in as I could possibly get it. Tip 7, always apply the primer and the glue to both the pipe and the fitting. Don't try to be neat and just apply the primer to the inside of the fitting and the cement to the inside of the fitting and not the pipe. You got to do it to the inside of the fitting as well as onto the pipe. You know, as I talked about before, the primer helps get that chemical reaction going, so it softens the PVC pipe. And listen, I've done this before in terms of try to be neat and only apply the primer and the glue to one or the other in terms of the pipe or the fitting. And let me tell you, you can get leaks. Tip number 8, always have some spare fittings on hand, because you never know when you might need something in a pinch. I live about 15 minutes away from a hardware store, so the last thing I want to do is jump into my car and go down and pick up a piece of whether it's pipe or another fitting. So I've got this big box here. I've had this box for years, and when I need something, I'll dig through, and more times than not, I'll find what I need. But yeah, the last thing you want to do is, like, if you're doing some work at night and the store's not even open. I mean, I guess Home Depot is open much longer hours than your typical hardware store, but you know, don't throw away the stuff you're using for a particular project after that project is done, because chances are you may need it in the future. One other thing, you know, when I'm out actually shopping for a project and picking up supplies, if I need, you know, if I spec'd out, let's say 5 90-degree 1-inch elbows, I would pick up 7 just to have some extras. You never know if you make some mistakes or if you miscount in terms of what you need for those fittings. They only cost like $1 or $2. Most of these fittings are really cheap. You know, the Schedule 40 stuff. The Schedule 80 is more expensive, but for the Schedule 40, it's cheap enough. Pick up some extra fittings in case you need them. Tip number 9, always avoid rough edges on the pipe. So I always recommend using a PVC pipe cutter for any job. It just makes it so much easier versus using a saw, PVC pipe saw. But if you have to use the saw, you're going to get these rough edges, and what you will need to do is to file down those rough edges to make sure you get a smooth bond, a tight bond between the pipe and fittings. And finally, tip number 10, always be safe. It's a great idea to use disposable latex gloves when you're working with the purple primer and the cement. A mask is a great idea. These fumes are pretty strong. In fact, I like to do my PVC projects outdoors in the spring, summer, or fall when the weather is warmer. Indoors, the fumes can be pretty hard to take. You know, even for the critters in the tank. I've got some branching orange Montipora that close up when I open up the lids in these cans. So yeah, it could be pretty strong. Well, those are my top 10 tips for working with PVC pipe. If anybody else has any great tips, please leave them in the comments below. Many thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.